He was the Silent Reaper, a man who controlled the docks, the streets, and the fear that gripped the West Coast. She was Juliet Park, 16 years old, invisible by design, surviving on expired bakery scraps and the art of disappearing. Liberty Clements had everything: a black Rolls-Royce, a mansion that glowed like a fortress, and enough power to end lives with a phone call. But on one frozen December evening in Chicago, when he saw his 5-year-old daughter Chloe leaning into the arms of a ragged, dirty stranger on his own front steps, his world stopped. He rushed over, ready to unleash the violence that built his empire. What happened next proved that even a ruthless boss can be undone by a single act of unexpected kindness. This is the story of one bitter winter night that collided two impossible worlds and changed them both forever. Stay with me, because by the end, you'll never look at power and survival the same way again. If you believe people deserve more than their circumstances, hit subscribe and comment where you're watching from. Let me tell you about the night everything changed. A night so cold the wind felt like shattered glass against your skin. This is a story about choices, about desperation, and about how one freezing moment can shatter every assumption you've ever made about who deserves mercy. Picture this: Chicago, December. Lincoln Park. The kind of winter evening where the wealthy rush from heated cars to heated homes, where mansion windows glow gold with warmth and safety. The kind of night when people like Juliet Brooks simply try not to freeze to death. Her name was Juliet Park, and she was just 16 years old. An age when most teenagers worry about basketball games and what to post online. Juliet worried about whether the bakery on Clark Street would throw out day-old cake she could take for her younger sister. She'd been surviving alone since she was 13, when her mother disappeared and child services never came. 3 years of shelters, abandoned buildings, and the constant, gnawing cold that Chicago winters deliver without mercy. That December night, Juliet had $4.37 in her pocket, a jacket 2 sizes too big with holes in both elbows, and her grandmother's tattered military blanket, the only thing left from a life that felt like someone else's memory. She walked past the mansions of Lincoln Park, head down, pace steady. Never too slow, that gets you noticed. Never too fast, that gets you chased. Invisible. That's how you survive when you look like trouble to people who've never known it. Then she saw her. A little girl, maybe 5 years old, in a bright blue dress completely wrong for December, sitting on marble steps, shaking uncontrollably, her face streaked with tears and terror. No coat. No adult. Just a child, freezing and alone in front of a house that probably cost more than Juliet would see in 10 lifetimes. Every instinct screamed at Juliet to keep walking. Getting involved when you're homeless, when you're black, when you have no proof you belong in this neighborhood, that's how you end up in handcuffs. Or worse. But the little girl looked up, and their eyes met. And Juliet stopped walking. Juliet Park had learned 3 rules for surviving Chicago winters when you had nowhere to go. Rule 1. Keep moving, always moving, because the cold kills anyone who stops. Rule 2. Never make eye contact with anyone who could call the cops, which in Lincoln Park meant basically everyone. Rule 3. Trust no one, help no one, because the second you become visible, you become a target. She'd perfected the art of being a ghost. Head down but not submissive. Pace steady but not suspicious. Backpack worn loose like she was coming home from a friend's house, not carrying everything she owned in this world. She knew which library bathrooms stayed unlocked until midnight, which gas stations wouldn't chase her off for warming up by the coffee station, which alleys had dumpsters, the restaurants filled with food that was only 1 day expired. 3 years of this. 3 years since her mother walked out for cigarettes and never came back. 3 years of telling caseworkers she was staying with her aunt so they wouldn't split her up from the memory of family. 3 years of making herself invisible because visible meant vulnerable and vulnerable meant destroyed. That's why every nerve in her body screamed at her to walk away from the little girl on the mansion steps. The child couldn't have been more than 5, drowning in a bright blue dress that looked like it cost more than Juliet had seen in months. Her blonde hair was tangled, her face red and puffy from crying, and she was shaking so violently that Juliet could see it from 20 feet away. No coat. No shoes. Just tiny bare feet on freezing marble and gulping breaths that sounded like drowning. A panic attack. Juliet recognized it because she'd had enough of her own. The girl must have run out during an episode, confused and terrified, and now she was trapped in her own fear, unable to go back inside, unable to do anything but shake and cry and freeze. Walk away, Juliet's survival instincts demanded. This is a trap. Rich white kid outside a mansion, and you're the homeless black girl who'll get blamed for whatever happens next. But the little girl looked up, and her eyes found Juliet's, and in that moment, Juliet saw herself 3 years ago. Alone. Terrified. Convinced no one was coming to help. Juliet's feet moved toward the steps before her brain could stop them. "Hey," she said softly, crouching down at a careful distance. "Hey, it's okay. You're okay." The little girl's teeth chattered so hard Juliet could hear them clicking together. Her lips had gone pale, that dangerous kind of pale that meant the cold was winning. The child tried to speak, but could only manage broken sounds between gasping breaths. "Cece cold," she finally managed. Can't breathe right." Juliet knew that feeling. The way panic and cold fed each other until your whole body felt like it was shutting down. She looked at the massive oak door behind the girl, easily 15 feet away, but it might as well have been a mile for a child trapped in her own terror. "Okay, listen to me," Juliet said, keeping her voice steady even as her own hands shook from cold and adrenaline. "We're gonna get you warm. But I need you to take slow breaths with me, okay? In through your nose, out through your mouth." The girl tried, failed, sobbed harder. Juliet made a decision that broke rule number 1. She stopped moving. She shrugged off her oversized jacket, the one she'd found behind a Goodwill 3 months ago, the one with holes in both elbows, but was thick enough to keep her alive through December nights. She wrapped it around the little girl's shoulders, and it swallowed her completely. But it wasn't enough. The child was still shaking, still that terrifying pale color. Juliet reached into her backpack and pulled out her grandmother's military blanket. Olive green, worn thin in places, with a name she couldn't quite read anymore stitched in faded black thread. It was the last thing she had from before. The last proof that she'd once belonged to someone. She wrapped it around the girl, then sat down beside her on the freezing marble and pulled her close, rubbing her arms, sharing what little body heat she had left. "There you go," Juliet whispered. "I've got you. You're safe." The girl burrowed into Juliet's side, tiny hands gripping the blanket like a lifeline. Her shaking began to slow, her breathing evening out as warmth crept back into her small body. "What's your name?" Juliet asked. "Chloe," the girl whispered against her shoulder. "I'm Juliet." "You're doing great, Chloe. So brave." They sat like that as snow began to fall, soft and silent, covering them both in white. Juliet felt the cold seeping into her bones without her jacket, felt the dangerous pull of drowsiness that came with hypothermia. She knew she should go, should get moving before she froze, should leave before someone came out and saw her here. But then Chloe's small hand found hers and squeezed. "Don't go," Chloe whispered. "Please don't go." And Juliet realized, with a fierceness that surprised her, that she couldn't. Not until this child was safe. Even if it cost her everything. Juliet heard it before she saw it. The low, predatory growl of an engine that cost more than most people's houses. Her head snapped up just as headlights cut through the falling snow, illuminating the driveway like a prison searchlight. A black Rolls-Royce, sleek and menacing, came to an abrupt stop 15 feet away. The door flew open before the engine even died. The man who emerged looked like violence personified. He was shirtless despite the December cold, his chest and arms covered in intricate tattoos that told stories of power and pain. A thick silver chain hung around his neck, catching the light like a weapon. His dark hair was slicked back, his jaw set in an expression that Juliet recognized immediately because she'd seen it on the faces of men who hurt people for a living. Liberty Clements. She didn't know his name yet, but she knew what he was. The kind of man who owned things. Places. People. His eyes locked onto the scene on his front steps, a ragged homeless girl holding his daughter, wrapped in a threadbare military blanket, and something dark and terrible crossed his face. "Get away from her," he said, his voice low and lethal, the kind of quiet that was more terrifying than screaming. "Get your hands off my daughter right now." Juliet's survival instincts kicked in with brutal clarity. Run. Run now. This man could make her disappear, and no one would ever ask questions. No one would even notice she was gone. But Chloe's hand tightened on hers, and the little girl pressed closer, and Juliet realized with sickening certainty that if she ran, she'd look guilty. If she ran, whatever this man thought she'd done would become truth in his mind. She was freezing, Juliet said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I was just trying to help. Help." Liberty's laugh was sharp and cruel as he strode toward them, each step deliberate and threatening. "You were helping by taking my daughter? By wrapping her in your filthy rags?" He was close now, towering over them, radiating rage and power and the absolute certainty that he could destroy her without consequence. Juliet looked up at him, at the tattoos that marked him as someone who'd survived things most people couldn't imagine, at the fury in his eyes that came from fear disguised as anger, and she understood. He thought she'd taken his daughter. He thought she was a threat. And in his world, threats didn't get second chances. If you believe people should be treated fairly and not judged by their appearance, hit subscribe. Trolls won't. ****. Liberty Clements reached for his daughter, his hand already moving toward Juliet's shoulder to shove her away, when Chloe did something neither of them expected. She screamed. "No, don't hurt her." Chloe threw herself in front of Juliet, tiny arms spread wide, her face fierce with a protectiveness that stopped Liberty's hand mid-reach. "Daddy, no. She helped me. She saved me." Liberty froze, confusion cracking through his rage. His eyes darted between his daughter and the homeless girl, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. "Chloe, baby, come here," he said, his voice shifting, becoming softer but no less dangerous. "Come to Daddy right now." "Not until you promise not to hurt Juliet," Chloe said, her chin jutting out stubbornly. "Promise, Daddy." Liberty's jaw clenched. He crouched down, bringing himself to eye level with his daughter, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of barely controlled fury. "I promise," he said. Then his eyes cut to Juliet like a blade. "But she's going to tell me exactly what happened. Every single detail." He straightened, crossing his arms over his tattooed chest, and fixed Juliet with a stare that had probably made grown men confess to crimes they didn't commit. "Who are you?" Liberty demanded. "What's your name?" "Juliet Park," she said quietly, forcing herself to meet his eyes even though every instinct screamed to look away, to appear submissive, to disappear. "I'm nobody. I was just walking by." "Nobody just walks through Lincoln Park at night," Liberty cut her off. "Especially not dressed like that. Try again. And this time, tell me the truth, because I can smell a lie from a mile away." Juliet took a slow breath, aware that Chloe was still pressed against her side, aware that one wrong word could end with her in a basement somewhere, aware that the truth might be just as dangerous as any lie. "I'm homeless," she said simply. "I was trying to stay warm, trying to keep moving." I heard Chloe crying. She was sitting out here alone, shaking, couldn't breathe right. She was having a panic attack, and she was freezing. So I stopped. I gave her my jacket and my blanket, and I stayed with her until she calmed down. She stayed even though she was cold too, Chloe added fiercely. "She gave me everything, Daddy. Everything she had." Liberty's eyes narrowed, scanning Juliet from head to toe, taking in the too-thin frame, the clothes that didn't fit, the backpack that clearly held a life's worth of possessions. His expression was unreadable, caught somewhere between suspicion and something else Juliet couldn't identify. "You're telling me," he said slowly, dangerously, "that you just happened to find my daughter. And instead of knocking on the door, instead of calling for help, you wrapped her in your blanket and sat out here in the freezing cold." "Yes," Juliet said. "Why?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with accusation. "Because she needed help," Juliet said, her voice quiet but steady. "Because she was scared and alone, and I know what that feels like. Because knocking on your door, looking like this." She gestured to herself. "That's how girls like me end up arrested or worse. But I couldn't just leave her there." Liberty stared at her for a long moment, his face an unreadable mask. Then he pulled out his phone, tapped the screen a few times, and held it up so he could see it while keeping his eyes on Juliet. She watched his expression change as he reviewed whatever was on that screen. The suspicion didn't disappear, but something else crept in. Something that looked almost like shock. "Marcus," he said sharply into the phone, never taking his eyes off Juliet. "Pull up the front entrance camera. Last 40 minutes. Send it to my phone now." 30 seconds later, his phone buzzed. Liberty watched the footage in silence, his jaw working as he took in every frame. Juliet approaching cautiously, crouching down, taking off her jacket, wrapping Chloe in the blanket, sitting there, shivering, holding his daughter for nearly 20 minutes before his car arrived.
No suspicious movements.
No attempts to enter the house. No one else involved. Just a homeless girl trying to keep his daughter from freezing to death. Liberty's hand tightened around his phone until Juliet thought it might crack. When he looked up, his expression was something she'd never seen before on a man like him. Conflict. Raw, agonizing conflict. "Do you know who I am?" he asked quietly. "No." Juliet lied, because admitting she recognized him as dangerous felt like suicide. "I'm Liberty Clements," he said, and the name landed like a threat. "I run things in this city that people don't talk about. I've built my reputation on being ruthless, on eliminating problems before they become problems. Do you understand what I'm saying to you?" Juliet understood perfectly. She'd just become a problem, a witness, a complication to whatever carefully constructed world this man had built. "You're saying I should have kept walking," Juliet said. "I'm saying you've put me in an impossible position," Liberty said, his voice tight with frustration. "My reputation, everything I've built, demands that I can't let you walk away from this. You know where I live. You've seen my daughter. You're a loose end." Chloe gasped, gripping Juliet tighter. "But my daughter is alive because of you," Liberty continued, and now his voice carried something that might have been pain. "She's safe because you sacrificed what little you had. Because you chose kindness when anyone else would have chosen survival. Only those who value ruthless power over simple kindness wouldn't like and share this story. Prove Liberty wrong. Hit the like button. ****. He looked at Chloe, then back at Juliet, a man caught between the monster he'd become and the father he still was. "So tell me," Liberty said, "what do I do with you?" The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of a decision that could go either way. Juliet felt Chloe trembling against her, felt the cold seeping deeper into her bones, felt the certainty that her life was balanced on the edge of whatever this dangerous man decided in the next few seconds. She'd saved his daughter. And that might be exactly what got her killed. Liberty opened his mouth to speak, and Juliet braced herself for whatever came next.
Prison.
A payoff to disappear. Something worse that she didn't want to imagine. But Chloe spoke first. "She stays." 2 words, delivered with the absolute authority only a 5-year-old who'd never been told no could possess. Liberty blinked. "Baby, it's not that simple." "She stays, Daddy." Chloe's voice grew stronger, fiercer. "She's my friend. She saved me when I was scared and you weren't there. She gave me her coat and her blanket, and she stayed even though she was cold. She stays, or I stay out here with her. Chloe. I mean it. Chloe crossed her arms, a mirror image of her father's stubborn stance. If Juliet has to leave, then I'm going with her, because she's the only one who helped me tonight. Liberty looked at his daughter like he was seeing her for the first time, this small fierce thing who'd inherited his stubbornness and apparently none of his ruthlessness. Juliet watched something crack in his expression, watched the calculation in his eyes give way to something far more dangerous than anger.
Love.
Helpless, desperate love for the little girl who'd just drawn a line he couldn't cross. You're asking me to trust a stranger, Liberty said quietly. I'm asking you to be kind, Chloe said. Like Juliet was kind to me. Liberty closed his eyes, his jaw clenching so hard Juliet could see the muscle jump. When he opened them again, he looked directly at Juliet, and what she saw there wasn't mercy. It was surrender. The guest house, he said, his voice rough. Behind the main house. You stay there. You don't leave without permission. You don't talk to anyone about this family or what you've seen here. You don't make me regret this decision. Juliet's breath caught. I don't understand. She stays, Daddy? Chloe asked hopefully. Liberty looked at his daughter, then back at Juliet, and something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but an acknowledgement that the world had just tilted on its axis and would never be quite the same. She stays, he said. And in that moment, Liberty Clements, the silent reaper, the man who'd built an empire on fear and power, made the first merciful decision of his adult life. It terrified him more than anything he'd ever done. The guest house was larger than any place Juliet had ever lived. 2 rooms, a bathroom with hot water that actually worked, and a bed with sheets that smelled like lavender instead of mildew and fear. It should have felt like a miracle. Instead, it felt like a trap with expensive furniture. Liberty's rules were delivered the next morning by a man named Marcus, built like a tank and watching Juliet like she might steal the silverware. You don't leave the property without Mr. Clements' permission. You don't answer the door. You don't talk to the staff about Mr. Clements' business. You see something, you forget it. You hear something, it didn't happen. Understood. Juliet understood perfectly. She'd been given shelter in a beautiful cage, and the man who owned it dealt in things that required silence and discretion. Over the next few days, she learned the rhythms of Liberty's world. Cars coming and going at odd hours. Men in expensive suits having quiet conversations in the main house. Marcus and 2 others always watching, always present, their jackets cut to hide whatever they carried underneath. Liberty himself barely acknowledged her existence. He'd nod if they passed on the grounds, but his eyes held a constant warning. Don't make me regret this. Juliet would have stayed invisible, would have kept to herself and counted the days until she aged out of whatever mercy he'd extended, except Chloe had other plans. The little girl appeared at the guest house every morning, knocking with determined persistence until Juliet opened the door. She brought coloring books, questions, and an absolute refusal to accept that Juliet should stay isolated. Daddy says you need to eat with us, Chloe announced on the 3rd day, taking Juliet's hand. Chloe, I don't think. He said it's okay. Come on. Dinner at Liberty's table was an exercise in tension. He sat at the head, Chloe to his right, and Juliet had been placed to his left like a problem he was still deciding how to solve. The food was incredible, the kind of meal Juliet had only seen through restaurant windows, but she could barely taste it under Liberty's silent scrutiny. Juliet knows all the places in the city, Chloe chattered, oblivious to the undercurrent. She told me about the library with the warm bathroom and the park where they have free concerts in summer. That's so, Liberty said, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp on Juliet. I moved around a lot, Juliet said carefully. I bet you did. Liberty cut into his steak with surgical precision. You learn things moving around like that.
How to read people.
How to see things others miss. Juliet recognized the test for what it was. He wanted to know if she understood what she'd stumbled into, if she was smart enough to be dangerous. "I learned how to survive," Juliet said, meeting his eyes. "And rule one of survival is knowing which battles you can't win." Something flickered in Liberty's expression. Not quite respect, but acknowledgement. 2 weeks into her stay, Liberty appeared at the guest house with an envelope. He didn't knock, just walked in like he owned the place, which of course he did. "There's $5,000 in here," he said, dropping it on the small table. "Get yourself clothes, whatever you need. Marcus will take you shopping." Juliet looked at the envelope like it might bite her. "I don't need $5,000. You're wearing the same 3 outfits on rotation," Liberty said flatly. "You need clothes." "I need maybe $200 for clothes," Juliet corrected. $5,000 is you trying to make yourself feel better about the system that put me on the streets in the first place." Liberty's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Careful." "Why?" Juliet met his stare. "You already decided not to kill me. And I'm not ungrateful, Mr. Clements, I'm really not. But throwing money at me doesn't fix anything. It just makes you feel less guilty about all the kids who are still out there freezing." "You don't know anything about me," Liberty said, his voice low and tight. "I know you built your power on a system that chews up people like me," Juliet said. "I know that for every one girl you let into your guest house, there are 100 more sleeping in subway stations tonight. And I know that money without change is just buying yourself permission to ignore the problem." Liberty stared at her for a long moment, and Juliet wondered if she'd finally pushed too far, if the mercy would run out right here, right now. Instead, he picked up the envelope and walked out without another word. But something shifted after that conversation. Juliet noticed it in small ways at first. Liberty on his phone, making calls that didn't sound like his usual business. Marcus driving to neighborhoods Liberty's world normally didn't touch. Conversations that stopped when she entered a room, but not in the threatening way they had before. 3 weeks later, Chloe came running to the guest house, waving a newspaper. "Daddy did something," she exclaimed. "Look." The article was small, buried on page 6. A new youth shelter opening on the south side, anonymously funded, no questions asked policy for intake, partnered with legal services and job training. No mention of Liberty's name anywhere, of course. Men like him didn't put their names on charity. But Juliet knew. That night at dinner, she caught Liberty's eye across the table. "Thank you," she said quietly. He didn't acknowledge it, didn't even nod. Just kept eating like she hadn't spoken. But the corner of his mouth twitched, just barely, and Juliet understood. Comment, "I stand for humanity. If you believe people like Juliet deserve a second chance, not the cruelty of the streets." The Silent Reaper was learning that some battles were won not with violence, but with the kind of quiet mercy that changed the world one shelter at a time. 5 years changed everything and nothing at all. Juliet Park stood in front of the modest storefront on Chicago's South Side, watching the sign being installed above the door. Park Clements Outreach. The name was deliberate, a message to everyone who saw it. The homeless girl and the Mafia boss, united in purpose. She was 21 now, finishing her degree in social work at Northwestern, paid for by an anonymous scholarship that everyone pretended wasn't from Liberty Clements. She'd grown into herself, filled out, learned to walk through the world with confidence instead of the desperate invisibility of survival. But she never forgot what those streets felt like. The Outreach Center was her idea. Liberty had provided the funding, the building, and the network of contacts that made things happen in a city where bureaucracy could crush good intentions. But the vision was hers, a place where kids like she'd been could get help without judgment, without the system that had failed her, without having to prove they deserved mercy. "It looks perfect," a voice said behind her. Juliet turned to find Chloe, now 10 years old, holding 2 coffee cups and grinning. The little girl who'd clung to her in the snow had grown into a fierce, brilliant kid who called Juliet her sister and meant it. "Your dad helped," Juliet said, accepting the coffee. "He's getting soft in his old age, Chloe said with a smirk that was pure liberty. Next thing you know, he'll be volunteering at soup kitchens. They both knew that would never happen. Liberty Clements was still the silent reaper, still ran his empire from the shadows, still made decisions that Juliet didn't ask about and he didn't explain. But he changed in ways that mattered. The shelters he funded, the legal advocacy he bankrolled, the quiet interventions that kept kids out of the system that had destroyed so many. He'd never be a good man. But he was trying to do good things, and sometimes that was enough. A black car pulled up to the curb and Liberty emerged, dressed in a suit now instead of showing his tattoos, though Juliet knew they were still there, still telling the story of who he'd been and what he'd survived. "Ready for the opening?" he asked. "Ready," Juliet said. Liberty looked at the sign, at his daughter standing beside Juliet, at the center that bore both their names, and something softened in his expression. "You know this makes us legitimate," he said. "No going back from this." "Good," Juliet said. "Because there are kids out there right now, freezing and scared, who need to know that someone's coming for them. That they're not forgotten." Liberty nodded slowly. "Your grandmother would be proud." It was the first time he'd mentioned her family, acknowledged the blanket she'd wrapped around Chloe that night, the legacy of service that had driven Juliet to save his daughter. "So would yours," Juliet said quietly, because she'd learned Liberty's story too, the poverty he'd clawed out of, the violence he'd survived. Don't let the Mafia win. Subscribe now to follow Juliet's journey against the broken system. Only trolls, haters, and manipulators won't subscribe. ****. They stood together, the reformed crime boss, the former homeless girl, and the daughter who'd bridged their worlds, looking at what they'd built from one freezing night and one impossible choice. Hit subscribe and comment. Not siding with the Reaper, if you believe kindness is stronger than all the power and wealth of Liberty's dark world. Kindness had won. And it would keep winning, one saved life at a time.